Welcome to the G5 Hive in our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive into the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening to us in podcast form, please leave a rate and review. Today, we'll be taking a look at the 2023 Sun Belt champions, the Troy Trojans. Troy finished an impressive 11-3 and made an appearance in the Birmingham Bowl. They wrapped up their 2024 spring practice with their spring game on April 27th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is a Troy beat reporter, and pro wrestling aficionado, Josh Boutwell. Josh can be found at Josh B Messenger on X. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Hey, I appreciate you guys.
We appreciate you coming on tonight, and tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you into being interested in sports journalism and eventually covering the Troy Trojans.
Oh man, no one's actually ever asked me this question, which is kind of funny. So in high school, got into a little bit of trouble, a lot of bit of trouble. So I would go to in-school suspension a lot, and they would always make you do a report. A book report usually, but one time they said you can do whatever you want. And I decided to pretty much recap a football game from that Saturday. And I was like, dang, I kind of like this. So that's what got me into maybe not getting in as much trouble and pursuing writing. And Troy, I was the sports editor for the Southeast Sun for about 8 years. So I covered Troy for that as much as they'd let me. Just covering big time college football has always been a goal for me. And the Christmas of 2020, Christmas 2021, maybe, I think, they told us that we were going to close down. So I had to find somewhere to go. And just so happened the Messenger was looking for a new sports editor. And that kind of just fell into my lap a little bit.
Awesome. As we mentioned earlier, Troy had a very impressive season in 2023, but with that success, change has come. They lose their head coach and virtually all of their coaching staff to Tulane. This offseason, they hired Gerard Parker, who was previously the offensive coordinator at Notre Dame. What can you tell us about Coach Parker and what he brings to the table for the Trojans?
Ironically, he's very similar to John Summerall personality-wise. They're both very personable people. I've said this many times in the past. I consider John Summerall a friend. The health issues that I've struggled with, he was constantly sending me text messages, checking on me, and still to this day he checks up on me. He's a good dude. Jared Parker is in that same vein, very personal but very passionate about football. They both have that in common. They seem to have maybe some kind of recruiting similarities too. John Summerall was very into going after the JUCO, which he felt like was a very kind of overlooked in the era of the transfer portal, and Jared Parker has hit that pretty hard too. So I think there's a lot of similarities there that I think Troy fans are going to really appreciate.
Well, as it often happens when you lose a head coach and bring in a new head coach, it means new assistants and new coordinators. Troy's no different in that regard. Coach Parker brings in a familiar face in Sean Reagan to serve as the offensive coordinator. He comes over from West Virginia, where he spent the last 5 years. Troy now has an offensive-minded in their head coach and experienced OC. Who's going to end up calling the plays here for Troy in 2024?
I believe it would be Sean Reagan.
Sean Reagan. Can you describe that type of offense then that Coach Reagan plans on running here at Troy?
Yeah, there's something I'm going to probably say a lot is between – it's really outside of that 3-year span with Chip Lindsey, a lot of synergy between Neil Brown – into John Summerall and now into Jared Parker. There's a lot of similarities in terms of a lot of these coaches have worked with Neil Brown. A lot of them have similar philosophies. Obviously, Sean Reagan, like you mentioned, he worked for Neil Brown. They've talked a lot about wanting to be very multiple. I think we'll definitely see Troy spread it out, probably akin to what we saw when Neil Brown was here. They want to run the ball for sure. That's been a big point of emphasis, but I think we'll definitely see them spread it out a lot. They'll go fast, but being multiple is something they've talked about a lot, being able to get into different sets and different formations, which again was very much what Joe Craddock and John Summerall wanted to do as well.
All right, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that is the quarterback. They lose last season's starter Gunnar Watson to graduation. However, they return Goose Crowder and Tucker Kilcrease. Crowder is the only one with game experience between the two, but his experience isn't vast by no means. How did that quarterback room look and shape up in the spring?
There was two quarterbacks. Tucker Kilcrease and Goose were the only quarterbacks during the spring. The only other quarterback on the roster actually left at the very beginning of the spring. So those two guys got a ton of work, which we probably 99% of the time wouldn't see between your top two quarterbacks in the spring. That probably helped and also hurt a little bit, just hurt wise in terms of the arm fatigue and things of that nature. But when you got two guys that don't have experience, getting them as many reps as possible is big. And especially for someone like Tucker, who's young. Goose is, you guess you could say, maybe young in terms of his eligibility, is young in terms of experience, but he's also been in the system at West Virginia for a couple of years, and then at Troy now for a couple of years. They're adding already some new guys to the roster depth wise, which is big, and that's one of the things that Jared Parker was very emphatic that they would be adding in the offseason because it was greatly needed, because you can't go into spring into the fall with two quarterbacks.
Did one of those guys kind of emerge as the starter or the leader in the room, so to speak, heading into the fall camp?
He's been very emphatic that he's not going to name a starter, and probably won't be telling me until the first week of the regular season. But it's Goose for the most part. I mean, the guys seem to kind of point towards that without openly saying it. He's a very he's a leader. He has a huge arm. He loves the deep ball. If you go and watch practices for 20 minutes, you're going to see this guy loves the deep ball. Tucker has a ton of things that he does well, especially mobility wise. He's a very mobile guy, but I think Goose is definitely the guy in the lead for it. One of the guys I mentioned that is coming in is Caleb McCreary. He's a Montgomery kid who's also very mobile. It'll be interesting to see what he adds as a true freshman. And then Matthew Caldwell is I think he's 6'5", maybe 215. They got from Gardner Webb, who's going to bring some more depth. And he also has a little bit more experience than those other guys at a lower level, obviously. But I believe he started 8 games in the last 2 years or something like that. He had some injuries, but he's depth-wise, he'll be big for this team.
Moving on to the running game, which lost the Sun Belt Offensive Player of the Year and 6th-round draft selection in Kamani Vidal. This room is relatively deep, but the guys have been kind of waiting their turn. You have Damian Taylor, Jarvis Williams, Jordan Lovett, and Tay Meadows returning. They also bring in Gerald Green from ECU. How did this running back room look in the spring?
Yeah, you don't lose the type of production that Kamani gave you, and it'd be an easy thing to replace. Not just last year. Kamani's been the guy for 3 or 4 years. But like you said, they do have some guys that do have some experience. Damian Taylor, I think he rushed for almost 400 yards last year, even with Kamani putting up the numbers that he put up. I think he's kind of the lead dog in a sense, but they were very open that this is going to be a running back by committee. But him, Jarvis Williams, Jared Green all had good springs. I'm really looking forward to seeing a guy, Keon Dunlap, who's an enterprise freshman from right up the street. When I was with the Southeast Sun, I got to cover him from the time he was like in 8th grade. He's a big kid, 6'3", 215. It'll be really fun to see him run the ball at Troy, so I'm looking forward to seeing him too.
When you say a running back by committee, do you think it's going to be like 2 guys, 3 guys? What are we looking at, 50-50, 60-40? What are your thoughts there?
I'm thinking we'll see at least 3 guys getting a ton of carries.
Okay. So week 1 versus Nevada, who do you think gets that first carry of the game?
Damian Taylor. I think he'll be the guy.
All right. And then, Josh, Troy's vying for a playoff spot. You're inside the 10-yard line. You got 4 rushes. Who are you giving the goal line carries to?
Oh, man. I have a very, very small sample size of seeing these guys. But
so are you saying Troy's not going to the playoffs then? Is that what you're saying?
I didn't say that.
Okay.
I would say Damian Taylor.
Damian Taylor. All right. Awesome.
Troy also takes a hit in the wide receiver room. They bring back Devontae Ross, and they also got a recent transfer from Cal, Marquez Dortch. I think that happened like May 15th. But they lose their leading receiver, Jabri Barber, over to Texas A&M. Deshaun Stoudemire graduated. And then they have another returning player who is currently battling some health challenges in Chris Lewis. Chris Lewis was recently diagnosed with osteosarcoma, which is cancer. What can you tell us about Chris Lewis and his battle?
Man, that's a good guy right there. I had my own things with cancer, and he was constantly sending me, and this is a personal thing. He was constantly sending me DMs and stuff. Keep your head up, things like that. When he had been diagnosed and no one knew about it, so this dude is 19, 20-year-old kid's got battling cancer, and he's checking on me. That's beyond cool. But he had surgery right before the spring game. They got it all. He hopes to come back and play this year. It's obviously, battling chemo and all that kind of stuff, and then having the surgery. That's a tall order. But, if they get him back, that's massive, because losing Jabri is huge. Another good kid, but a great player, and that's 2 years in a row. Troy's lost their leading receiver, Tez Johnson, the year before, and then Jabri last year. But getting Chris Lewis back, who's like the human highlight reel at receiver, that would probably be the biggest thing for this offense for sure.
So, in lieu of the losses and Lewis's absence, how did that wide receiver room look during the spring?
Surprisingly, really good. There's a guy that I think is going to surprise a few people. First off, Landon Parker is a kid that was a senior last year, and then when I saw him on the practice field, I said, "How did you get extra eligibility?" But he's another big kid that getting him back is going to be big. Peyton Higgins is another guy that getting him back is big. But Zariah Beeson is the guy that I was talking about, who's is a JUCO transfer, but he started out at Oregon State. He was making plays every practice I was at. I think he scored 3 touchdowns in the spring game. He'll be huge. But Devontae Ross is another guy who also returned kicks. He'll be big. MJ Johnson's another enterprise kid who's really speedy. Reminds me a lot of Jabri. He's another guy that I think that can be big for this offense.
So I realize he just made a commitment recently, but what kind of role do you think they see for Marquez Dortch? He's 6 foot even, 175 pounds.
Probably in a Jabri role is what I would be thinking, because it kind of seems to have that same body type. Watching a little bit of the tape that I could find of him, he seems to be that speedy type of receiver. Just probably more than anything, man, getting more depth for this group with experience too. It was big, and especially not knowing with Chris Lewis's, if he'll be able to come back this year.
All right, we got a lot of time now between here and week 1 here at the end of May. But if you had to take a guess now, who do you think lines up as the starting wide receivers against Nevada in week 1?
If Chris is healthy, he'll be there. He'll be one of the guys for sure. But other than that, Landon Parker, Devontae Ross, and Zariah Beeson are the guys that I'm kind of zoning in on that. Obviously with Dortch, the new guy, you got to see where he kind of falls into things. But those 3 to me have kind of stood out so far.
Moving over to the tight ends, can you describe for us how you expect the tight ends to be utilized in this Reagan offense?
Yeah, that was something that Neil Brown liked when he was in Troy, having that big receiver that can make a big tight end that can make plays. I think Ethan Connor is kind of the prototypical tight end in that offense. He's athletic freak. He's another guy that when you go to practice, he's constantly mossing guys, making catches over the top of defenders. I think we'll see him get plenty of reps and plenty of shots down the field too.
And then they brought in a Iowa Western Community College transfer in Trey Schwartz, 6'5", 250. How did he look in the spring?
Big blocking tight end, which is another thing in this offense we're probably going to see a lot of, especially because there's only technically one fullback on the roster, and when you get into those goal line situations, he's going to be big for the offense. And Brody Dalton, who was a UAB transfer last year.
So we were talking before we start recording, and one of the units that took one of the biggest hits this offseason was that offensive line. They lose left tackle Derek Graham to Texas A&M. left guard Blake Austin to the transfer portal. Grant Betts, the right tackle, graduated. They only returned about a third of that room from 2023. You do have right guard Daniel King and center Eli Russ returning. How did the coaching staff kind of address these losses in the offensive line this offseason?
Several JUCO guys. That was a big thing. That's been a kind of a factor in really all levels of the team, and going after JUCO guys who they think can contribute right away. Those guys like Derek Graham, you losing an all-conference player is huge. But I think as much as anything, the amount of guys that left that were depth guys hurts even more, because you're going to, especially in the offensive line in the trenches, you're going to have guys that are banged up. You're going to need there's going to be more than 5 guys that have to play at some point. So that was really big. Getting Eli Russ back at probably your biggest position on offensive center is huge. He's a great player. He's a leader of that group. So that was really big for the offensive line to get him back. But it's going to be a lot of turnover on that spot. And I think we saw a lot of shuffling in the spring. We'll probably see a lot of shuffling in that group in the fall as well.
Did they kind of gel in the spring? Did they look? Are you really worried about them, or do you think that they showed signs of progress? I guess in the spring.
They showed signs of progress, especially by the time we got to the spring game. But that would be my biggest question mark, probably on the whole team. Even with all the losses on defense, the offensive line is just so important, and it's something that gets overlooked sometimes because of obviously all the flashy players on offense. But that offensive line, you have to have a great offensive line to do what they want to do. Do what anybody wants to do, whether you're throw it around 40 times a game or you want to run the ball. You got to have an offensive line that can either block for your backs or you can keep your quarterback upright. So that's the biggest thing going into the fall for me.
All right, if you have to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who'd that be?
Zariah Beeson is actually, I mentioned him a couple of times. I'm really looking forward to see what he can do in the fall, and I think he's going to have a big year.
All right, as you might expect, when there's a new coach, there'll be a new head coach. Is also a new coordinator leading the way for the Trojans defense, and that is Dante Wright. He comes to Troy from West Virginia, where he most recently served as the safeties coach. What style of defense can we expect to see from Coach Wright?
I mentioned that synergy. Another West Virginia guy, another Neil Brown guy. I think we're going to see a very similar style of defense, an odd front. They're keeping the same verbiage with the bandits and the spears and all that kind of stuff. So I think it'll be very similar. I think it'll be very aggressive. I think you're going to have to be aggressive, especially blitzing when you're replacing so much pass rush and obviously so much on the back end. Getting to the quarterback is going to be big.
So moving on to the personnel that will run Coach Wright's defense in 2023, this defense was 3rd in the nation in sacks, 10th in the nation in points allowed per game. But let's first take a look at that defensive line. Luis Mendia, Raymond Cutts, Julian Peterson all return, but they lost roughly 80% of this room. They're going to need to replace guys like the leading sack getter in Javon Solomon, Buda Jones, TJ Jackson, Zach Edwards, AJ Pierce, among others. How did that unit look in the spring, and did anyone stand out to you?
Raymond Cutts, man. Every time I've seen that guy, even back last year, he just stands out. When he gets off the bus, he stands out, just the size and everything. He's a JUCO All-American coming into Troy. I feel like he's going to be a big factor this year. Luis Medina, getting him back is so huge for this defensive line, because you mentioned, all that production that was lost, not just from Solomon, but other guys. AJ Pierce has been a guy that's been on that defensive line as long as I can remember, and he's a Dothan kid too. So getting him back was huge as a leadership guy, as a guy that will give you production. He played in all 14 games last year. So that was big, but Raymond Cutts and Luis Medina are going to be big for that. And on the interior defensive tackle, it's going to be interesting to see who can step in that Buda Jones role. There's a ton of freshmen and JUCO guys that are coming in. Another guy right down the street I mentioned from Enterprise, Jah-Mal Fields-Me, huge He's like 6'4", 315, something like that. Another guy I've seen since he was in like 8th grade. I'm looking forward to seeing him at Troy too. So just, a ton of new faces, but it's going to be excited to see what these guys can do, because I think there definitely is some really good talent in that group.
And I believe they had in Jah-Mal Williams, a Cincinnati transfer. How did he look in the spring?
Very fast. That's one of the things that he stood out from him. So I'm looking forward to seeing more of him, but he was very fast. I think he'll be a guy that's kind of in that bandit role, which is, they're having to replace Richard Jubiner, which is another guy. Oh, I think Javon Solomon and Richard Jubiner are both in the top 5 in sacks in Troy. And when you're talking about a school that has Osi Umenyiora and DeMarcus Ware in the sack record book, that's pretty huge.
So speaking of the linebackers, it loses top tackler from 2023 and Jaden McDonald off to Indiana. They also lost the aforementioned Richard Jubiner to graduation. They do bring back Jordan Stringer and his 68 tackles from a year ago, along with Terry Thomas, Malachi Pegues, Eric Shaw, and others. How did the linebackers look in the spring?
Especially on the inside, I'm looking forward to seeing those guys. I think they did really well. They had some guys that were banged up even in the spring. Stephen Catledge, he's another guy like Raymond Cutts that he stands out when he just gets off the bus. He's a huge guy. He was injured a lot last year, but I think he's kind of probably the leading guy for the Mike linebacker, middle linebacker. Jordan Stringer and Terry Thomas both played a ton last year, and I think they'll both play in the other linebacker spot. I already mentioned Jah-Mal Williams at Bandit. Eric Shaw is another guy who at one point I believe he was a 5-star recruit when he went to South Carolina. I believe he was either a safety or a receiver. Troy got him and turned him into a Bandit. He's another guy, a ton of speed. As he continues to fill out his body, he's going to be fun to see as well.
The defensive backfield suffered losses this offseason as well, losing corners O'Shai Fletcher, Reddy Stewart, and Don Callis to graduation. They lost free safety Del Pettis and strong safety Urshad Davis to graduation, not to mention strong safety Keyshawn Swanson to Western Kentucky. And to top it off, they lost that spear position Caleb Ransaw and Chris Rogers, both to Tulane. Who stepped up to fill these roles in the spring?
Man, there are so many new faces in that secondary. It's pretty insane. Demaje Yancey, Trent Henry, Samaj James, and LJ Green were all 4 guys at corner that Jared Parker kind of singled out more than once as having big springs. Henry is a Grambling State transfer, and Samaj is a JUCO transfer. Those are 4 guys that I'm kind of expecting to play a role this year for sure. But then there's also, I think, 5 or 6 true freshmen and JUCO transfers that we haven't seen on the field yet at corner. Safety, you lose a ton of production from a guy like Del Pettis, Urshad Davis, like you mentioned. They have 2 transfers. Ian Connerly Goodley, who is a guy that they just got in as a transfer from Southeast Louisiana. He was an all-conference safety. He's a big safety. I think he's going to be interesting to see in the fall. Cecil Powell is a North Carolina State transfer that I think is going to have a big role this year. At Spear, they have 2 guys, Jordan Perry, a Kansas State transfer, and Devin Lafayette, Northern Illinois transfer. So I think those 2 guys will probably battle for that spot at Spear. Jordan Perry is a big guy, 6'2", 200. I think Lafayette's probably the same size too, but they both have good speed as well, which, Spear, for those that really don't know, that's kind of a hybrid linebacker safety spot. I think some schools call them rovers, things like that. So having speed as well as that size to be able to get down and play on the runs big.
So you mentioned like all the different guys and some guys that we haven't seen yet. How did that unit look overall, like cohesively together?
They had some flashes, like those guys at corner that I mentioned. Not just Jared Parker was singling them out, but I believe Trent Henry had, I think, maybe 2 interceptions in the spring game. So they definitely had flashes. Obviously, they're a new group. They're having to gel together just like the offensive line. Especially that communication with the safeties in the back end is going to be something that's really big in the fall.
If you had to pick a defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be?
Either Stephen Catledge or Raymond Cutts. I'm expecting big things from both of those guys. those guys. I mentioned that they pass that eye test when you see them. I think they're both going to have big years this year.
Do you think cuts can kind of help fill some of that lost sack production?
Yeah, that's the big thing. It's hard to come in and try to replace 16 sacks, which came from one guy, but I think he's definitely going to be able to produce for these guys as a pass rusher. That was kind of his specialty at the JUCO level.
So with spring practice now over, you mentioned a little bit you're worried about that offensive line, but it kind of sounds like maybe that secondary is something to be worried about too. What are those the only two groups that you feel concerned about, or are there more?
Well, it starts at the quarterback. Obviously, when you're replacing a guy like Gunner who played 4 or 5 years, that's big. But yeah, other than that, defensive backs in general and the offensive line, those are definitely the things that I'm kind of focusing on because at every other level, for the most part, there is guys that have experience. There's guys that have played pretty much at every level. Like we mentioned, Medina on the defensive line, Jordan Stringer and Terry Thomas at linebacker. The receivers are several guys that have made plays. Ethan Connor made plays last year at tight end. So, and the running backs, Damian Taylor, even though there's not a ton of experience there, he did get a pretty good bit of carries last year. So there's experience at every level except for those that I mentioned at defensive back, offensive line, and quarterback.
So is there anything in particular that the coaches are trying to look at adding here in the transfer portal? And at this point, is it just depth pieces?
I think for the most part, it's depth pieces. Quarterback was one of the main things Parker mentioned coming out of the spring that they had to add guys. They've already added one. I mentioned the Gardner-Webb quarterback. I think we may see another one just because depth, like I said, depth reasons. But I think for the most part, we've seen several guys in the last 2 months that have been added. They had actually, was it last week, Shaman Jordan, which is a guy who originally committed or signed with Eastern Michigan, got out of his letter of intent and switched over to Troy on the defensive line, which would be another big one. But I think we'll see mainly depth guys get added in the next maybe month or so.
What would you say is the main strength of this team heading into 2024?
I think those skill guys at receiver. I think there's just a ton of talent there. And like I mentioned, there is some experience, even though you lose a guy like Jabri Barber. There's a ton of experience. A ton of talent, a ton of speed. There's guys with great size like Chris Lewis, and so if they get all those guys healthy in the fall, I think it's going to make that whoever the quarterback is going to make his life a lot easier.
When it comes to recruitment of new players and the retention of existing players, how has NIL and the transfer portal impacted Troy?
I would say just like any other group of five, man, it's hurting. When you can have agents or whatever in a guy's DMs telling them, hey, if you enter the portal, I can get you so-and-so at another school, this stuff like these group of five schools really can't compete with. The transfer portal has become an unregulated free agency pretty much. So, it's just the new way of college football. And, it's whoever can manage it the best is going to turn out the best. It's a new team every year. It's pretty crazy.
It seems like more and more the demands of the head coach is really turning more into like a general manager between having to, recruit freshmen, recruit players out of the transfer portal, work on retaining his current players, fundraising, etc. And maybe they're less involved in the actual X's and O's. Do you see that at Troy, or do they have, additional staff to try to kind of help with some of those responsibilities?
I think it really is all on the head coach for the most part, but also trying to keep his hands in the football at the same time. You see Jared Parker at, charity functions and, trying to do fundraising stuff and, Trojan Tour stuff that they're doing right now. While also, like you mentioned, trying to retain guys, trying to get guys in the portal. So, and these smaller schools, I don't think you can really put a specific person on the staff to do that kind of stuff. It has to be the head coach. He has to wear all those hats.
When does Troy have a collective started, and like how long? When did they start that roughly?
Started it last year. So you'll see a lot of stuff for especially local businesses that will go through the collective to get sponsorships with different players and merchandise and stuff like that.
So, given all the recent success and all the changes in the coaching staff and personnel, what does success look like in 2024 for the Troy Trojans?
I mean, if you ask the team, they'll say a third straight Sun Belt crown. To me, if they get to a bowl game, that's big. Just the amount of turnover that they saw, not just in the players but the coaching staff. I mean, getting to a bowl game will be a win, in my opinion.
So we've talked a lot tonight about coaching changes, offense and defense. Is there anything else you want to share or think we should know about this 2024 Troy football team?
Man, it's just like I mentioned, the synergy. I think that's the biggest thing from last year's staff to this year's staff. I think Troy fans are gonna see a lot of similarities between John Summerall and Jared Parker, which is something I mentioned. It's a hard-nosed team. You just watch them in practice; they're really hard-nosed. And then that's one thing that you're gonna have some struggles with guys gelling and trying to fit in roles and things of that nature. But those guys are out there busting their tails every day, and they're gonna grind no matter what. So I think that's a big thing for this team. Is just they're gonna have that same attitude as we've seen in the last few years.
Well, thanks again, Josh, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today.
It's my pleasure. Anytime.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.
1, 2, 3, 4. Here's to the school we love. We're coming for an hour.